Hey guys, this is part 19 of Azure tutorial. In this video, we will see how to deploy a SQL Server derived code to Microsoft Azure. What are the software requirements to carry out this procedure? First of all, we require Visual Studio 2019, then we require SQL Server Management Studio 2019, and we have installed both of these software in part 16 of this tutorial. And then we require Microsoft Azure Data Studio, and we have discussed about it in part 17 of this tutorial. The video URL of both of this video will be uploaded in the description of this video. Now, what are the steps to deploy? To deploy a data-driven web application to Microsoft Azure, there are three steps to follow. First, you deploy the Visual Studio Code to Azure, and we already discussed this in part 13 of this tutorial. Then we need to create SQL Server in Azure and then create the SQL Server objects in Azure and see data. Now let's see how to deploy a SQL Server data-driven web application to Microsoft Azure. Here is the web application that we need to deploy to Microsoft Azure. Right now, the text that you see on this screen is coming from the database, and we need to deploy this to Microsoft Azure. Here is the project source code in Visual Studio, and right now we are looking at the web.config file. Here, the two important things that we need to keep in mind are the connection string property and the custom errors piece of code. Now here we have a connection string specified in the configuration section. Then we are adding a connection string named DBCS. It's a short form for database connection strings. And then we are specifying the connection string as server is equal to the computer name. Now if you want a server name, you can click this connect object explorer icon. Here we will see the server name. Let's close it for now. Then database is equal to sample DB. Now here is the database I'm using for SQL Server, and then integrated security is equal to SSPI, and this means that we are using Windows authentication to connect to SQL Server. Now this piece of code is used to avoid runtime errors in our application. Now let's look at the default.aspx page. This is standard ASP.NET code with a little bit of bootstrap used in it. The important thing is this ID property, repeater steps, and in this we are specifying our data. Then here we are on the code behind file of the default.aspx page. This is standard ASP.NET code. Here we are creating a string variable using and specifying the connection string to it using the configuration manager class. And if you want to use the configuration manager class, here is the connection string for that using system.configuration. Then we are creating a list of string called steps. Then we are creating a SQL connection object, naming it con, and then SQL command object cmd is equal to new SQL command, and look at the command that we are using. Select steps from TBL steps. Now in SQL Server, when we execute this command, we get the following three steps under the steps column in the TBL steps table, and then we are relating it to con, and as the con is relating to the connection string and a connection string is relating to the DBCS connection string, the database that the connection string points, the this piece of code will be executed against that database, and it's a good thing too. Here now we are opening the connection and then using the SQL data reader object, creating an object named reader and executing the data that we got from the SQL command object. And while the reader is reading the data, we are adding the rows that we get under the steps column to the steps list of string, and then we are simply returning the variable. So here, and this procedure is called get steps, and then when the page loads, we are setting the repeater steps ASP.NET item template. as and we are when we are we are setting the data source as the get steps. So this so the repeater steps, so the ASP the repeater control, we have will have all the table row, and then we are simply calling the data bind method. This is a simple application that we need to deploy to Microsoft Azure. So as the first step is to deploy the Visual Studio Code to Microsoft Azure. To deploy it, right click on the solution and then click on this publish button, prominent publish button. Where are we publishing today? We are publishing to Microsoft Azure. Let's click next. Now which Azure service would you like to host your application? We want to use Azure App Service. Let's click next and then subscription free trial app service instance. There are currently no instances available, and this is the reason of why, because I don't have any resource group and of course don't have any resources. Then so let's create a new resource app service. Let's name our app service, it's SQL app service subscription free trial resource group. Let's create a new resource group. Let's name it RG as per the naming convention, and then test SQL app service. Let's click this OK button, and the hosting plan. Let's create a new hosting plan. In the name, let's give the default one. Location East US, and then size. Let's select the free pricing tier. Then let's click OK, and let's click this create button. Now it's creating the app service and the app service plan in Microsoft Azure. It's gonna take a couple of minutes to create this, and also it is creating this resource group. So I'll just pause the video for you guys. So here our app service instance is created. Let's click this finish button to finish creating the profile. Now here our web application is successfully ready to publish to Microsoft Azure. All that is left is to click this publish button. Let's click this publish button. Now it's publishing our web application to Microsoft Azure. Let's give it a few seconds to be published. Here we get, when we run our web application, here we get an error saying access is denied. A network, and especially or specifically it's a SQL exception. A network related instance or instance specified error occurred while establishing a connection to SQL Server. And as you can see in the URL, it's azurewebsites.net. And if I take a look to Microsoft Azure portal, and if I refresh this, I will see a resource group created, but I don't have any Azure SQL Server or SQL database created. Now this means that this error is straightforward. This error is occurring because we don't have any SQL Server in Azure. Again, there are various ways to create SQL Server in Azure. We can use Visual Studio 2019 uh, to create SQL Server in Azure, or we can directly create it through the Azure portal. Let's create it in Visual Studio 2019. Let's close this output window, and then here we have to add a service dependency. Now currently there are no service dependencies configured. Let's add a service dependency. Now what service dependency do you want? We want an Azure SQL database. Let's click next. So here subscription free time, and currently we don't have any SQL databases created. Let's create a new one. So let's click this button, create new. Database name, let's leave the default name. Subscription name, free trial. Resource group, of course the default resource group. And in database server, we have to create a new database server. Keep the default name, location East US. Administrator username, let's enter in my name, and then let's specify the password. Okay, let's click this OK button, and then let's click on this create button, and here it will start creating this Azure SQL database in Microsoft Azure, in this and specifically in this resource group RGTest SQL app service. Let's pause the video to for because it will take a long time to create the database. So there we go, our SQL database and SQL server is completely created. Let's now click this next button. Now here it asks the database connection string. Let's keep it as it is, as in my web application. Let's name it dbcs database connection username. This is the username and this is the password. Let's click this next button. Then it has a dependency on two new Git packages. Let's click this finish button, and here it's connecting, or it's finishing the creation of the service dependency. It won't take a large amount of time. So here it's completed. Let's now click this close button, and here we have our Azure SQL database. Now let's refresh this page and let's see what happens. Here we have a different exception: invalid object name tbl and tbl steps. Now here if you go to the Azure portal, let's refresh it, and here we will see our SQL Server and SQL database created. If I go to the SQL database and then if I go to the query editor in SQL database, let's enter in the password. Okay, it says cannot open SQL Server or SQL Derivation DB server requested by the client. So we need to go to the SQL Server and have a modification. Okay, let's go to the SQL Server, and to solve this error, scroll down a bit. When you get to Security tab, click on Networking, and then here here on the firewall rules, click this button, add your current IPv4 address. Click this button and say save. Here is now successfully updated the server firewall rules. Now let's go to the databases, and then let's click the SQL derivation DB, and then let's click this query editor. Let's once again try to sign in. Let's click this OK button. Now it's logging in and it's successfully logged in. When we expand the tables folder, we don't see anything, and that's why we are getting this error: invalid object name tbl steps. Now of course there are many ways to solve this error. We can either insert SQL objects through the Azure Query Editor, or SQL Server Management Studio, or Azure Data Studio. So we will see all the three methods. Let's go to SQL Server first, and to connect to Microsoft Azure, click this connect button. Then server, we want the server name. So let's go to the SQL Server, and then we have to go to the overview blade, and here we see the server name. Let's copy it to clipboard and then paste it right over here. Then let's use SQL Server authentication, specify the username and password, and then finally click this connect button. Now it's establishing a connection to Microsoft SQL Server, Microsoft Azure SQL database. Now here is our connection. Let's open it, the databases folder, and we will see our database. Let's open a new query editor window, and here let's select the database as. Okay, let's move it above. Let's right click on it and say connect. Sorry, what I'm doing. Let's select this database and right click on it, and I'm right clicking on it. Right click on it and say new query. Now here it's launched a query editor window, and then let's copy this create table script, and then let's paste it right over here, and let's click this execute button. Command completed successfully. Let's now move over to the our app service. Let's refresh it. Now we won't get any error, but we won't see anything. That's because our table doesn't have any rows. Let's insert the first row to the Azure Data Studio. Clear server name, sorry, server name. Here is the server name. Let's click on copy and then paste it. Then SQL authentication. I want SQL login. Then specify your username and password. Database, including database. Let it load fully. So here the database is loaded. I want to click the SQL derivation DB and then um, let's click this connect button. So establishing a connection between SQL Server in Azure and Microsoft Azure Data Studio. Connection successful. So here is navigating to a table, navigating to a page. Let's click this new query and then let's move on to SQL Server. Let's copy the first query and then let's paste it and let's click this run button. So one row affected. Now when we refresh this, we will see one row and then let's insert the other two rows through the Azure portal. Now here let's go to SQL databases, SQL derivation DB, query editor, then login, and then let's paste these two queries. Query succeeded affected rows 2. Now when we refresh this, we will see the other two objects or table rows. And we have successfully deployed our web application SQL Server data driven to Microsoft Azure. In the next video, we will perform CRUD operation or also known as CRUD operations on the deployment using Azure Data Studio. CRUD by the way means for create, read, update and delete. That's it in this video. Thank you for listening.